On the night the storm rolled through Little Mercy, Father John vanished without a trace. His bicycle was still parked in the rectory yard, untouched. The lights in his room were off, the door locked from the inside. By morning, the diocese had sealed his quarters, and whispers began to swirl of confessions gone wrong, of footsteps in the hallway, and a truth the church couldn't afford to face. It had been raining hard that night, the kind of storm that turns streets into rivers and silence into a deafening roar. Little Mercy, a rural town tucked into the folds of northern Missouri, was used to bad weather. But not like this, not with thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the church, and lightning that split the sky like God's own warning. That night, Father John Alcott was supposed to be inside St. Augustine's parish house, the modest brick residence behind the chapel where he'd lived for the last 7 years. His routines were strict, nearly monastic. He retired at 9 p.m., woke at dawn, prayed before coffee. Everyone knew his habits, and that made his absence all the more chilling. The next morning, as the sun pushed through the lingering clouds, the church's maintenance man, Leonard Price, came to check for storm damage. When he passed through the iron gate and into the yard, he froze. Father John's bicycle, an old navy blue Raleigh with worn leather grips, stood upright on its kickstand in the gravel path. Rain still dripped from the frame. The back tire was caked in mud, fresh. But there was no sign of the priest. His front door was shut but unlocked, something he never did. Leonard called out, his voice tentative. No answer. Inside, the house was still. The light in the hallway flickered slightly, a bulb near the end of its life. A single cup of chamomile tea sat on the kitchen table, cold. The priest's raincoat was still on its hook. By noon, the town knew. Father John was missing. Sheriff Macy Langford, a woman known for her no-nonsense attitude and her tight ponytail, showed up before the local press even got wind. She stood in the living room, hands on hips, staring at the open Bible on the desk in the study. Psalms. The last page bookmarked, the passage underlined, "Hide not thy face far from me, put not thy servant away in anger." No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. But something was off, too neat, too frozen. Then came the order from the diocese, a sealed envelope delivered by courier instructing Sheriff Langford and her team to vacate the parish house immediately. The investigation would now be handled internally by ecclesiastical authority. Before she could protest, the bishop's assistant arrived with papers, legal ones, asserting jurisdiction over the property. By evening, a wooden board sealed the door to Father John's room, stamped with a wax insignia of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. No one was allowed in. The town of Little Mercy was no stranger to rumors. They whispered them like hymns, behind shelves in the general store, beneath the bleachers after high school football games. But this time, the rumors weren't whispered. They surged. Some said Father John had run off with a widow from the next county. Others suggested foul play, involving outsiders, drifters, or worse, something inside the church. Still others said nothing, just stared at the locked room, at the untouched bike, and wondered what darkness had passed through their town that night. Margaret Denning, who volunteered at the parish office, remembered something strange from the day before. He seemed tense to hollow. The sheriff was trembling. He kept asking me if I believed everyone could be forgiven, not in a soft, hopeful way. Her words lodged like splinters in Langford's mind. By the end of the week, memorial candles flickered outside the church. Parishioners left flowers near the bike, now rusting slowly in the moist spring air. No one had heard from Father John, no phone call, no letter, nothing. The Sunday service that followed his disappearance was led by a substitute priest flown in from Jefferson City. He read scripture with perfect cadence but blank eyes. "Walk by faith," he said, "not by sight." But sight was all the people of Little Mercy wanted: evidence, closure, a trail, anything. And all they had was a bicycle, a locked door, and a priest whose last words were likely never written down. The town's initial shock turned into a kind of numbness as days passed with no word from the authorities or the church. Rumors circled like vultures, feeding on silence. But not everyone had been silent. A week after the disappearance, Walter Grady, the elderly caretaker of St. Augustine's, approached Sheriff Langford just outside the diner. His weathered face, pinched by age and arthritis, was clouded by something more pressing than memory. "I was there that night," he said. eyes not quite meeting hers. She motioned for him to continue, and he did, voice low but steady. I was locking up the side doors like I always do when the storm started. Around 10:30, I passed the back hallway. You know the one behind the sacristy? She nodded. I heard it, he whispered. Heard what, Walter? Footsteps. Heavy, slow. Not quick like running. He paused, then shook his head. But I thought maybe it was just the wind, playing tricks. The old floorboards shift in weather like that. I didn't go check. Sheriff Langford narrowed her eyes. You didn't think to mention this before? Claire's gaze dropped to the sidewalk. I thought I imagined it, but the way the boards creaked, it sounded like someone walking with purpose. That detail haunted her. She remembered how the floor inside the parish house had groaned slightly beneath her boots. Real old wood, uninsulated, sound carried. She jotted it into her notebook, next to a growing list of strange remarks and open-ended thoughts. Something about that hallway had chilled her even during the initial walk to the walkie-sleekle team. That same afternoon, at the church's weekly soup kitchen, Sheriff Langford lingered, not as a guest, but as a quiet observer. The volunteers exchanged glances, clearly aware of her presence, but she wasn't there for small talk. That's when Lorraine Stabler, a devout parishioner in her 70s, known for her lace veils and tireless devotion, to her chest. Can I speak to you for a moment? She asked. They stepped into the annex hallway, where the air was thick with the scent of lentil stew and old pine. Lauren hesitated, then pressed on. I don't want to speak ill of Father John. He was a good man. But something was burdening him. He came to me after confession last Tuesday. Not for me to confess, mind you, but he needed someone to talk to. He looked pale, like he'd seen a ghost. Told me he heard something in the confessional. Sheriff Langford's brows raised slightly. He said a penitent, a man, had come in, voice disguised, whispering fast. Said things about the church, about sin rooted in this very parish. Did he say what kind of sin? He didn't specify, Larry replied. Only said some things should not be forgiven. She swallowed. He kept repeating that. Langford felt a chill run through her spine. After their conversation, she went back to her cruiser and sat for a long time, notebook open in her lap. A heavy, deliberate step in a hallway during a storm, a priest shaken by a confessional encounter he wouldn't describe, a locked room sealed not by investigation but by ecclesiastical power. She found herself staring at the church steeple through the windshield, its cross dark against the setting sun. Then she wrote one line, the last confession. Later that evening, she went over the parish's schedule and traced back every service Father John had conducted in the week before his disappearances. Nothing out of the ordinary, baptisms, weekday mass, 2 funerals. But Friday evening stood out. A confession service had been extended by nearly an hour, noted in a scribbled margin in the sacristy logbook. No names, of course, that was sacred. But the extension was odd, and more curious, the logbook page that followed was torn at the corner, as if someone had hastily turned the page with shaking hands. The only visible mark left was a faint smudge of black ink across the bottom margin. She took a photo with her phone. The next morning, Sheriff Langford made her way to the town's only print shop. She knew the owner, Hank Doyle, used to be a typesetter back in the day. She showed him the photo and asked if he could make anything of the ink. Hank frowned, adjusted his glasses, and after squinting for a few minutes said, "Might be a partial word, can't be sure, but this curve here looks like part of a G, maybe." It was grasping at straws, but it was something. 2 more people came forward over the weekend. A teenager who said he saw Father John sitting alone in the chapel one evening, whispering, and a woman who swore she heard the priest raise his voice during a late-night phone call. She didn't hear the words, only the tone, frustrated, scared, like someone who knew something he wished he didn't, she said. Sunday, Sheriff Langford returned to the church grounds, officially as a visitor, unofficially as an investigator. The temporary priest led Mass with bland efficiency, but Langford wasn't listening to the homily. Her eyes drifted to the side hallway, the one Walter Grady had mentioned. She watched it as if expecting someone to emerge from its shadows. No one did, but when she stepped outside afterward, a folded note had been tucked under her windshield wiper. No envelope, just a single line in shaky, handwritten script. It wasn't the storm that took him. No signature. She unfolded it again as she sat in her car. The ink was still damp. That meant someone had placed it there recently. She scanned the lot. Empty. The storm may have passed, but something darker was stirring in its wake. Sheriff Langford reread the anonymous note again and again, the words burrowing deeper each time. It wasn't the storm that took him. She had already circled back to the hallway where Walter claimed to hear footsteps, had revisited Lorraine's story of a confession too unsettling to repeat, and now something even stranger, the sudden disappearance of Samuel Dykes. Samuel was a familiar figure in Little Mercy, though few people used his name. Most just called him the man behind the church. He had been sleeping intermittently in the small sheltered alcove beside the church's maintenance shed for over a year. Father John, unlike many, never called the sheriff to move him along. Instead, he gave him warm food, clean blankets, and a quiet place to stay. It wasn't charity, it was dignity, and John believed in that deeply. Samuel, in return, kept to himself and never caused trouble. He was the kind of man you didn't notice until he wasn't there. 2 days after Father John disappeared, Samuel vanished too. Langford didn't hear about it right away. The homeless didn't file missing person reports. It was only after Leonard, the groundskeeper, mentioned that no one had seen Samuel around since the storm that she took notice. His usual belongings, a no tarp, a duffel bag filled with patched clothes, and a dog-edged paperback Bible, were gone. What wasn't gone, oddly, was a pair of his worn-out boots, heavily left sitting neatly by the bed of the fence. She found that strange. Samuel never went barefoot, even in summer, even in the heat. Always those boots. It suggested he hadn't left willingly, or hadn't had time to pack everything. Or maybe he wasn't the one who packed. Langford checked nearby shelters. Nothing. She called the nearest hospitals. No John Does, no admittances matching his description. A gas station clerk on Route 7 claimed to have seen someone like him trying to hitch a ride westward the night after the storm, but there was no follow-up, no name, no proof. Just another thin thread pulled into the wind. What bothered her more than his absences was the fact that no one in the church ever mentioned him. Not even once. It was like Samuel's quiet presence had been scrubbed from the parish's memory, the same way the logbook corner had been torn, surgically and with intent. And then there was Elise. Elise Monroe had been the parish library assistant for the past 3 years. Quiet, thoughtful, always early to work. She had a background in archival research, and Father John trusted her implicitly. He once referred to her, half-jokingly, as his living legger. It was Elise who managed the priest's personal appointment calendar, hand held out like sacred text. It was Elise who transcribed details from sensitive meetings that were not to be typed or emailed, and it was Elise who, 5 days after the priest's disappearance, submitted her resignation via a one-line email. "I can no longer continue in this role. Please do not contact me." No explanation. No notice. She didn't return her key. When Langford knocked on the door of her small duplex on Crestwood Lane, no one answered. The blinds were drawn. Mail stacked outside. Neighbors said she had left in a rush. Bags packed into a rented sedan and hadn't been seen since. The landlord confirmed the lease had been paid in full, 6 months in advance. Elise was gone. Langford filed a formal inquiry with the Diocese, requesting access to any documents Elise might have left behind. She was told, in a terse email, that all internal records, including those compiled by Miss Monroe, fall under ecclesiastical protection and are not subject to civil review. That same day, her request for a second walkthrough of the rectory was denied again. She began to feel like someone was building a wall faster than she could find ladders. Her next stop was the library itself. While the staff priest, Father Gregson, cold and ceremonial, performed evening prayers with the congregation, Langford slipped into the modest room lined with bookshelves and hymnals. The desk where Elise once worked had been cleared, almost too neatly. No pens, no folders. But in the return bin, beneath a stack of devotional pamphlets, she found something that didn't belong. A torn sheet from a yellow legal pad, partially crumpled, with writing scrawled in blue ink. It was incomplete and barely legible in parts, but one line caught her attention immediately. "He asked me to erase it. said it was safer that way, but I made a copy. The rest of the note was a chaotic mess of scribbles, including a line that read, "Not everything confessed should be forgiven." The phrasing matched Lorraine's memory from her conversation with Father John. Langford pocketed the note and stepped outside, scanning the parking lot. No one. Not a soul. It had begun to rain again, not a storm, but a steady drizzle that made the town sidewalks shimmer under the yellow street lamps. A familiar unease crept back in. Elise had run. Samuel had vanished. Everyone connected to Father John's private life was either gone or silent. The silence, she realized, wasn't passive, it was strategic. Back in her office that night, Langford pulled out the parish visitor logs from the week before the disappearance. The entries had been scanned and digitized for archival reasons, something Father John insisted on despite their age. Elise had been the one to oversee that process too. She clicked through the pages, searching for anything unusual. Most names were regulars, but on Thursday, one day before the confession that Lorraine referenced, there was a name that didn't fit: Martin Devlin. She ran it through local databases. No address in Little Mercy, no employment, no driver's license. But one match, a police report filed 15 years ago in Kansas City in connection with a domestic disturbance involving a minor. The charges had been dropped, the file sealed. Still, the coincidence was enough to raise her blood pressure. She leaned back in her chair, the overhead fluorescent light buzzing faintly. What had Father John gotten himself into? And why did everyone else seem so intent on forgetting him? The phone on her desk rang once, then stopped. When she picked it up, there was only silence on the other end, not a click, not even static, just silence thick enough to press against her eardrum like water. The silence on the other end of the phone that night had unsettled Sheriff Langford more than she admitted to herself. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of it, like whoever called her wasn't breathing, wasn't waiting to speak, but was simply listening. It had stayed with her, that unease, all through the next morning when she received an unprompted visit from someone she hadn't seen in over a decade. Theo Montrose. He stood in her doorway just after 8 a.m., carrying a folded brown envelope and an expression carved by regret. Theo had left Little Mercy 15 years ago, shortly after graduating high school. He was lanky now, bearded, with a stiffness in his shoulders that suggested he hadn't come back lightly. He sat down across from her, placing the envelope on the desk. "I heard about Father John," he began, "and I remembered something I probably should have told someone a long time ago." Langford leaned forward. "Go on." Theo rubbed his hands together. "Before he was here, he was assigned to a parish in Birch Lake, small town about 100 miles north. I went to school there before moving here my senior year. He taught religion classes once a week, didn't wear the collar then, just khakis and a button-up, but everyone knew who he was." He paused. "Was an incident. One day he stopped showing up. No warning, no announcement. Teachers wouldn't talk about it, just said he'd been reassigned. The rumors got bad. Something about a student, something said in confession that spooked him." Langford's brows pulled together. "Was it ever reported?" Theo shook his head, publicly. "But my older brother worked janitorial at the school. He said one night he found John sitting alone in the gym, crying. Said he kept repeating, 'I should have told someone, I should have told—'" He tapped the envelope. "I kept this, found it in one of the school yearbooks years later, thought it was weird." Langford opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a photocopy of a staff memo from Birch Lake Academy, dated June 2008. It read, "Effective immediately, Father John Alcott has been reassigned by the Diocese. Faculty and staff are instructed to refrain from public comment regarding this transition. Any inquiries are to be directed to the office of the superintendent." The tone was clinical, sanitized, but beneath the bureaucratic phrasing was a clear message. Cover it up. Langford looked up. "Did you know him well?" "Not really," Theo admitted. "Well, kind. Too kind, maybe. Always seemed haunted. We thought it was just part of being a priest, but after what I've been reading lately, I don't know anymore." After Theo left, Langford pulled up records from the diocese, publicly accessible ones, and found no mention of Birch Lake in Father John's official history. His appointments jumped from seminary to Little Mercy, with a vague pastoral development period listed as the in-brief. She knew enough about institutional language to recognize that as a placeholder. a ghost entry meant to obscure rather than explain. That afternoon she returned to St. Augustine's, not to the rectory this time, but to the basement archives of the church office, a place she hadn't dared to explore until now. Margaret Denning, hesitant but quietly defiant, led her in through the side door. "You didn't get this from me," she said simply, handing Langford a large brass key. The archive room smelled of dust and dry paper. Files lined metal cabinets, some so old the labels had faded to near nothing. Langford searched through the Alcott folder, expecting to find standard parish logs and correspondence. What she didn't expect was a leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of budget reports. It was Father John's handwriting, no doubt. The entries were dated weekly, simple notes about visits, confessions, community activities. But as she turned the pages, she noticed something jarring. Right before the final dated entry, a clean cut, a full page missing, torn out neatly like it had been sliced with a razor. The remaining edge showed the faint trace of blue ink, enough to confirm the page had been filled before it was removed. Langford's heart thudded. She photographed the journal, then ran her fingers along the torn edge. The entry before the missing page was from March 10th. It read, "Meeting with Lorraine this evening after Mass. Still uneasy about Thursday's confession, something about the voice. It didn't sound like a man in search of redemption." The next dated entry skipped to March 24th, 3 days after Father John vanished. Only this time it wasn't in his handwriting. It was a single line, written in all caps with a different pen. "Do not look where he looked." She flipped the book closed and sat back on the cold stone floor of the archive room, the whisper of dust settling back into place around her. Somewhere between March 10th and the 24th, something had been removed, erased, but not entirely. Someone had been in the journal after the priest had vanished, and they wanted to make sure no one followed what he'd left behind. On her way out, she stopped in the sanctuary, drawn by the low hum of choir practice. As the voices echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceiling, she noticed something strange near the confessional booth, a wooden panel that didn't sit quite flush against the wall. She moved closer. No hinges, no visible opening mechanism, just a slight gap. When she pressed gently with her fingers, it didn't budge. She didn't push harder, at least not yet. Instead, she turned back, the journal under her arm, the warning still fresh in her mind. That evening at home, Langford called an old contact in the state clerical registry, someone who owed her a favor. "Look up Birch Lake Academy. Anything connected to John Alcott from 2007 to 2009? Staff logs, parish assignments, incident reports, even rumors?" The voice on the other end sighed. "You know this stuff gets buried fast, but I'll dig." Langford ended the call and stared at the cut in the journal spine again, wondering what was on that missing page, wondering who had taken it, wondering, too, if Father John had really been afraid of what was confessed, or if he'd been afraid of what he already knew. She didn't sleep that night, neither did the town. The day after her sleepless night, Sheriff Langford sat alone in her office, surrounded by photocopies, handwritten notes, and her own doubt thickening like smoke. She'd read the journal entry a dozen times, trying to make sense of the gap, the handwriting switch, the command to stop digging. But stopping wasn't an option anymore, not with everything that had unfolded. She was about to call the diocesan office again, though she knew the answer would be another denial, when her phone vibrated, silent. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Langford." Silence. Then a man's voice, cautious but clear. "I don't have long. I can't talk in person, but I have something you should see." "You won't hear this from the Archdiocese?" She kept her voice even. "Someone on the council. I can't say more. Check your email. I sent you 4 photos. That room isn't empty." The line went dead. Langford opened her laptop, her hand suddenly colder than before. In her inbox was a new message, no subject line, no signature. The photos were attached as "present" photographs of grainy but unmistakably real. The first showed a corner of Father John's private room, the room sealed under the Archdiocese's authority, the very same room she'd been barred from entering. A twin bed with crisp white sheets was visible, except the pillow was dented, recently used. The second photo captured the floor under the desk, a thermos, half-smoked, and a paperback mystery novel in French. The third photo zeroed in on the window, its latch scraped, as if pried open from the inside. The final image, though, stole her breath. A partially burned candle lying sideways under the bed, wax-hardened in a puddle. But this wasn't any candle. It was a Benedictine ritual candle, used only during formal rites of exorcism. She knew this from her time spent training with Catholic trauma response units. Only authorized clergy carried them, and only for one reason. She stared at the images for a long time. Someone had not only entered the sealed room, they'd been living there, possibly hiding, possibly waiting, or maybe watching, and whoever had taken those pictures had risked a great deal, because if the Archdiocese learned that a council member had broken protocol, the consequences would be swift and severe. By noon, Langford found herself parked 2 blocks from the home of Gerald Whitlow, a longtime member of the church's governing council. Retired military, quiet, disciplined. She had seen him at the last candlelight vigil, standing stiffly by the altar, refusing to speak to the media. When he answered her knock, he looked surprised but not confused. "You've seen the photos," he said plainly. "Yes." "Then you know I didn't take them lightly." They sat on his porch, away from the eyes of passing neighbors. He leaned in, voice low. "They sealed that room 3 days too late. I have reason to believe someone was still inside after Father John disappeared. Possibly even Father John himself." She blinked. "You think he was hiding?" He tapped his knuckle against the wooden railing. "So before they locked the place down, I went in to collect his vestments for the substitute priest. They didn't want a scandal. Empty robe hangers would have raised questions. That's when I noticed the bed, still warm. Someone had been there, and not just once. And the candle? That, Gerald said, was the part I didn't understand. I've only seen those once, back in the Gulf, when a chaplain tried to cleanse a barracks after a suicide. It's not something they use lightly." Langford took a long breath. "Do you think Father John was performing an exorcism?" Gerald shook his head. "I think he was preparing for one, or worse, trying to protect himself from something he believed had already begun." He stood, hesitating. "I know my limits. I've served this parish for 40 years, but what's happening here? It's bigger than we thought." Back in her car, Langford stared out through the windshield at the church steeple in the distance. Was Father John trying to cast something out, or was something being hidden in? She thought about the confession Lorraine had mentioned, about the whisper that had left John shaken, about the voice that didn't sound like a man seeking forgiveness. What had he heard in that booth, and had it followed him home? That evening she returned to the church once more, this time under the pretense of delivering security paperwork. Father Gregson received her with forced civility, but she noted the brief flicker of unease when she mentioned she'd like to pray alone in the chapel. As she walked past the confessional, she glanced again at the misaligned wall panel. Her fingers brushed it lightly. Still sealed. Still holding secrets. Upstairs, she passed the locked room. It was still boarded from the outside, but now she looked at it differently. That door hadn't just sealed a crime scene, it had sealed a narrative, a version of events Twee approved and protected. But the candle under the bed told a different story. Someone had been afraid, deeply, viscerally, the kind of fear that drives a man to rituals long considered obsolete. Before she left, she took one final look back at the hallway. It was quiet, unnervingly so, but something in the air had shifted. The stillness wasn't peaceful, it was expectant, as if waiting for someone to ask the next question, or perhaps stumble onto the next wrong answer. As she reached for the handle to the main doors, her phone buzzed again. Another email. No text, no subject line. Just a single new image attachment. It showed the inside of the same room, but now the bed was unmade. The candle was gone. And on the desk, illuminated by a shaft of morning light through the curtain, was a sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in red ink. He never left. I wasn't supposed to get involved. I'm not a cop, not a reporter, not anything special, just someone who's lived in Little Mercy my whole life. I run the hardware store on Main, the same one my father owned, and I've known Father John Alcott since the day he arrived. He was kind to my mother when she was sick, and he used to fix the hinges on our front door himself, refusing payment. So when he vanished, I paid attention. At first from a distance, then closer, and then too close. It started with the envelope, No return address, no handwriting, just one typed line across the front. To someone who remembers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, typed on an old manual machine, the kind that imprints deep into the paper. It read, "There's more in the old R cabinet, beneath the floorboard, before they get to it." I read it 3 times before folding it back into the envelope. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I told myself I wouldn't act on it, that it was a prank or a mistake. But I found myself in the church basement anyway, pretending to drop off a box of spare bulbs for the vestry. No one questioned me, people trusted me, and I'd never given them a reason not to. The archive room hadn't been used in years. It was colder than I remembered, with a musty smell of paper, rust, and something faintly metallic. The green file cabinet sat in the far corner, slightly off kilter. I pulled it away from the wall, and the sound of its legs scraping the concrete sent a shiver up my spine. The floor beneath was uneven. I knelt down and ran my hand along the cracks until I found one loose tile. It came up easier than expected. Beneath it was a hollow space, and inside that, a cassette tape in a clear plastic case, labeled simply, March 16. That was so hollow that it considered tape in a clear plastic case, labeled simply. I stared at it, pulse loud in my ears. I didn't have a player, not anymore, but the library did. That evening, after the building had closed, I used the spare key I still had from when I used to volunteer there on Saturdays. I sat alone in the back room, lights off, tape player whirring softly. The hiss of static came first, then a voice, Father John's. Quiet, tired. "I don't know who will hear this," he said, "but I have to say it, even if no one ever plays it." There was a pause, then a low breath. Told me I was being paranoid, that the man in the booth was just a disturbed mind looking for attention. But I heard something in his voice, something not right. I've heard confessions of every kind, but this one felt like a warning. Another pause. The chair creaked, as if he had shifted in his seat. He told me names, not all but enough to connect dots I wasn't supposed to see. He said they meet, not here but beneath, a place below, before the renovations, before the records. My stomach clenched. Beneath. Like under the church? Or was he speaking metaphorically? The recording continued. "I've found pieces, hints, but if I say anything, they'll strip me of my collar. Worse. I've already been warned once, but I can't hold it in anymore. I won't." A loud click cut off the next sentence. The rest of the tape was silence. But before it ended, I heard something else, a faint echo in the background. A second voice, maybe, too soft to make out. I rewound it twice, played it again, each time that same whisper under his breath, just before the click. It was like he was playing it with me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched. From the moment I stepped into the archive to the moment I locked the library door behind me, my skin crawled like something was just out of sight, breathing down the back of my neck. The next day, another envelope arrived. Same paper, same typing. This one said, "It wasn't just his secret. Check the baptismal logs, 1989. That wasn't Father John's era. That was Father Brennan's, the man before him, dead now 10 years. I drove to the church during open hours and asked to see the historical parish records. For genealogy, I lied, tracing my family line. They let me in. No one watches you closely if you've been around long enough. The baptismal logs were kept in the side sacristy, thick leather-bound ledgers with gold leaf on the spines. I flipped through them until I found the year, June 1989. My eyes skimmed page after page of familiar names, families I knew. Then one entry jumped out. The name was redacted, just a thick black line across both first and last. But the sponsor's name was there, John Alcott. My hands went cold. That couldn't be right. He hadn't arrived until 2009. I checked again, same page, same handwriting, same date. Had he visited before? Or had he been connected to this place longer than anyone knew? When I asked Margaret Denning, under the pretense of casual conversation, if Father John had ever visited before his assignment, her eyes tightened. He once said he'd been here before, briefly, for seminary training, but no one ever confirmed that. Maybe he was just being polite, but the name in the register hadn't been politeness. It had been deliberate. Someone had tried to hide it. And someone else had tried to preserve it. That night I sat in my living room, tape in hand, staring out the window as the wind picked up. Another storm was coming, I could feel it. But this one wasn't about weather. It was something older, something buried. The tape was still in my pocket when I saw headlights flash outside. A car I didn't recognize pulled up across the street. No one got out. No one knocked. It just sat there, engine humming, lights off after a moment, watching, waiting. The next morning, another envelope. I didn't sleep after the third envelope. By now each one felt like a match struck in a room soaked in gasoline. This one didn't contain a warning or a clue. It held a photocopy of a letter. Not just any letter, but internal church correspondence. The heading bore the Archdiocese seal, faint but bettable. The date was recent, just weeks before Father John vanished. It was a short message, written in a tone far colder than anything spiritual. If Father John speaks, the structure we've built will collapse. He must be guided firmly. Failing that, containment. It was signed only with initials, MM and RH. That alone might have meant nothing, if not for what broke on the news the next morning. The regional bishop, Most Reverend Malcolm Grant, had stepped down without warning. No farewell mass, no press statement, just a single sentence issued from the Archdiocese's media office. Due to health and personal discernment, Bishop Grant has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The town barely had time to absorb it before the rumors started, but I knew. I had seen the initials. Massive. The same man who signed the letter was now gone, and it wasn't health. It wasn't discernment. It was fear. Later that afternoon, I drove to the newspaper office in Bellerton, the next town over. The editor there, a wiry woman named Sloane Harris, had published a piece earlier in the week speculating on diocesan interference in Father John's case. We'd never met before, but as soon as I introduced myself, she gave me a look like she'd been expecting me. "You're from Little Mercy," she said. "You've seen the edges." I nodded. "And I've heard pieces." Sloane didn't waste time. She pulled out her laptop, clicked open a folder labeled Alcott Reacted AALC, and showed me a screenshot of an email she'd sent 2 days before Grant's resignation. It was addressed to the Archdiocese's legal office and asked a single question: can the office confirm the nature of Father John Alcott's reassignment from Birch Lake to Little Mercy in 2005, and whether any disciplinary process was involved. She never got a reply, but within 36 hours, Grant stepped down. Sloane leaned in. "I've been tracking clergy reassignments for 8 years. There are patterns, paper trails, but Alcott, his file reads like a painting that's been scrubbed too hard, ink faded, dates overwritten, no signatures." She paused. "Whatever happened before he got to your town wasn't a footnote. It was a cover-up." I showed her the copied letter from the envelope. Her lips tightened. "You know what this is, right?" she asked. "It's not a confession. It's a contingency plan. They were already assuming he might talk." That word, talk, rattled in my chest, because the recording I'd found, the one of Father John in his own voice, had hinted at that very struggle. He was teetering. Someone had pushed, and now the man who authorized that push had vanished from public view. Back in Little Mercy, the church bulletin the following Sunday made no mention of the bishop's resignation. It did, however, contain a curious announcement. The upcoming diocesan audit of St. Augustine's had been postponed indefinitely. No reason given. Father Gregson, who usually delivered Mass with impersonal poise, seemed visibly unsettled. His hands shook slightly as he raised the chalice. After the service, I lingered in the vestibule, watching people pass through, watching who looked over their shoulder. That evening, another email arrived, this time not from a stranger, but from an old friend, Paul Denham, a seminarian who'd studied under Father John years ago and now taught religious history at a small college in Iowa. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. His message was short: "Saw the news about Grant. Thought you should know I found a letter in the diocesan archive where I interned. It mentioned your town by name. Thought it was weird. Attached." The file was scanned poorly, but the content was clear. It was addressed to the Vatican Liaison Office, dated April 2006, signed by then-Dean Raymond Hauser, R.H., the second initial from the envelope letter. The subject line read, "Transfer Logistics, St. Augustine Parish." The body of the letter mentioned the necessity of relocating Father Alcott to a parish with minimal press presence and limited interdiocesan visibility. The phrase that chilled me, while his theological conduct remains unchallenged, the implications of his knowledge render his continued assignment in Birch Lake untenable. It wasn't about sin. It wasn't about scandal in the usual sense. It was about something he knew. Something so volatile they couldn't risk him staying where he was. So they sent him to Little Mercy, a town built on silence, distance, and blind trust. They didn't bury him, they planted him, and when he started to grow curious again, to remember, to piece together the gaps, they came for him. I printed the letter and taped it to the wall beside the others. I now had a string of resignations, denials, and redacted records, all pointing to the same conclusion. John Alcott had carried a secret not just about one confession, but about a pattern. A system, one they had maintained for decades, and someone in power had decided that silence was safer than salvation. That night, I walked past the church and saw the office lights on. I stepped closer, through the hedges, careful not to be seen. Through the window, I saw Father Gregson pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his face pale. I couldn't hear everything, but one sentence rang out, carried through the glass with terrible clarity. "No, I don't care what the files say. If they dig any deeper, we lose the whole thing." Then he paused. Yes, even that. His back was to me, but his shoulders sagged like a man who'd realized the dam was cracking faster than he could plug the holes. I returned home under a sky too quiet, the wind too still. The same envelope sat waiting on my porch. The envelope on my porch that night felt heavier than the ones before, though the paper inside was no thicker. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it under the porch light. Inside, as always, was a single typed page. This time it said, "He tried to stop it once. That's why they sent him to you. Look for the case from July 1993, not on the books, but still in the ground 30 years ago, long before Father John had arrived in Little Mercy. But something about the phrasing, 'not on the books,' rattled me. I didn't sleep, I didn't wait. At dawn I drove straight to the sheriff's station. Langford wasn't in, but her deputy, Tom, owed me more than a few favors. He hesitated when I asked to look at archived incident reports from the early 90s, but finally relented in long 5 minutes, he said. "And you never saw this?" We unlocked a back cabinet, long untouched. Dust fell like flour as I opened the top drawer. I flipped through file after file until I found it, thin, faded, nearly illegible. It wasn't labeled as a missing persons report. Instead, the file was marked Unexplained Juvenile Welfare Concern, July 1993. Inside were only 2 pages. The first detailed the discovery of a bicycle found behind the church, still upright, no child in sight. The second was a statement from the then pastor, Father Brennan, stating the boy was known to wander. Perhaps the storm drove him further than usual. No name, no follow-up. No closure, just a child, gone. I took a photo of the file and sent it to Sloan, the journalist from Bellerton. Within an hour she called me, her voice tight. I found a matching article from a local weekly that year. The boy's name was Nathaniel Drew, age 9, disappeared after attending catechism class. The story was pulled from print 3 days later. The paper cited editorial discretion. She paused. But the priest mentioned in early drafts was a visiting deacon, newly ordained, name redacted, but I checked ordinations for that summer. Guess who? My stomach sank. John Alcott, I whispered. He was there. He was involved. Sloan confirmed it. He'd been in Little Mercy before, just for a few weeks. Unofficial summer placement, before his first assignment in Birch Lake, and Nathaniel Drew vanished during those weeks. Back at home, I pulled out the copy of Father John's journal, the one I'd scanned after sneaking into the archive room. I hadn't looked closely at the date of the missing page before, but now I saw it clearly. The entry before the torn section was labeled March 17, the date he referenced in his tape, the one where he said he couldn't keep the secret the one where he spoke of a boy. It wasn't a confession from a stranger, it was a memory, and it wasn't new. It had been with him for 30 years. I stared at the photograph of the journal's missing page, and for the first time noticed a faint indentation on the following sheet, as though someone had pressed too hard with their pen. I used a pencil to lightly shade over the paper. Letters emerged, faint but visible. Nathaniel. I failed him. I failed them all, and now they think I've forgotten. But I remember everything. Beneath that, just one sentence: if I disappear, it's because I finally told the truth. The words echoed in my mind all day, and then another call, this time from Paul Denham, the seminarian turned professor. His voice was breathless. "You were right," Alcott testified once. "It was sealed, but I got access through an academic request for research." In 2001, he gave a closed-door deposition to a clerical tribunal regarding abuse by 2 senior priests in the Birch Lake Diocese. His testimony was enough to begin an investigation, but it never led to charges. Instead, both accused were quietly retired. And Alcott? Assigned, officially, it was for spiritual renewal. It was exile. They buried him in Little Mercy, not because he was guilty, but because he knew. The deeper I looked, the more patterns I found: missing documentation, sealed files, reports rewritten or removed, and always the same name hovered in the margins: Alcott. Always close, but never central. Always just far enough to be deniable. I went back to the tape again. This time, I played it in reverse. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe? Somewhere near the midpoint, a sound emerged that hadn't been clear before. A muffled phrase, spoken low, as if to himself. It sounded like, "The room is not empty. It never was." That sent me back to the photos from the sealed room. The candle, the unmade bed, but now something else. The bookshelf. I zoomed in. One book had been moved between shots. Subtle, but definite. Its spine read "Saints and Sinners, Church Discipline in the 20th Century." I found a copy through a second-hand shop in Kansas City and had it overnight. When it arrived, I flipped to the chapter marked in the photo, Chapter 11, Clerical Consequences Without Conviction. And there, in clinical language, the process was laid bare. When a priest posed a reputational risk but hadn't been formally convicted, they were sometimes relocated to fringe dioceses under the guise of health or retreat, often with little to no public record. It was known as the silent fold, a way to make someone disappear without vanishing them entirely. I closed the book and stared at the page, my heart hammering. John Alcott had been folded away, not for wrongdoing, but for knowing what couldn't be allowed to live in the light, and in the end, he had started to speak. Not loud, not to everyone, just to a few, but even whispers can echo, and they had heard. The storm outside broke suddenly that night. Rain slammed the windows, thunder cracked low and long, and when the power flickered and died, I sat in the dark, holding the tape recorder like it was a lifeline. I knew then that the final answers weren't in files or books. They were in the ground, beneath the place that had tried to forget Nathaniel Drew, just like they'd tried to forget John Alcott. And I knew where to go next. I went back to the church the next morning with the storm still clinging to the streets, and the air heavy with the kind of silence that follows bad news too big to say aloud. I didn't go through the front this time. I used the alley, slipped past the chapel, and around the maintenance shed until I found the narrow side entrance where the stone foundation met the original frame of the building. That door hadn't been opened in decades, but the lock gave with a soft crack once I forced the screwdriver just right, and the door swung open into blackness and dust. I was no longer operating on instinct. I was following facts, documents, testimony, voices of the dead and nearly dead, and now I had coordinates. Paul Denham had cross-referenced the original blueprints of St. Augustine's direct parish construction permits from the 1930s and unearthed something everyone else had missed: an old burial vault beneath the sanctuary, sealed and forgotten. Or deliberately hidden. Sloane Harris met me there. She'd driven down from Bellerton overnight, bringing more than just questions. She brought a forensics kit, gloves, a camera, and the courage I didn't realize I needed. We entered the basement with only flashlights and determination. The floor was uneven, lined with loose stones and long-abandoned cleaning equipment. At the far end, behind a rusted furnace, was a section of wall that didn't match the rest. Cement poured, too smooth, too modern. "This was patched over," Sloane said, running her hand across the surface. "And not in the 19th century." We worked in silence for hours, slowly removing bricks and layers of drywall until the faint outline of an archway appeared. A faded carving above it read, Aeternum veil, Latin for farewell forever. We stared at it. Then we opened it. Inside was nothing like a proper crypt. It was cramped, narrow, a dirt floor littered with chunks of crumpled plaster and old decayed wood. But deeper inside, past the first curve, we found what had been hidden. Bones, recently disturbed, half buried in loose soil, wrapped in something that might have once been cloth, but was now stained and matted beyond recognition. I stood frozen. Sloane dropped to her knees with lattice gloves, gently broaching the soil away. "There's more," she whispered, "much more." Beside the remains was a rusted tin box. Inside it, folded carefully, was a cotton handkerchief, embroidered with the initials J.A., and a single strand of dark hair tied with thread. We didn't touch anything else. We called Langford. The sheriff arrived in under an hour, silent and grim. She looked at the remains, then at us. "You realize what this means?" she asked. "We'll need DNA confirmation," but her voice held a note of something else, not just dread, expectation, like she had been waiting for this discovery to emerge. It took 4 days for the forensic team to finish their sweep. The bones were catalogued and sent to the state lab. Preliminary tests confirmed something startling. The hair strand matched Father John Alcott's mitochondrial DNA, but the bones, those were someone else entirely, a teenaged male. Approximate age, 15. Estimated time of death, early summer 1992. The press release went out 2 days later. Human moraines since July 1992. The town stopped breathing. People who had whispered theories in bars now sat in silence. Mothers who'd once told their children bedtime stories about the boy who wandered into the woods now cried in grocery store aisles. 30 years, and all this time he had been buried in the church's shadow. Langford summoned me the following morning. She didn't speak much at first, just handed me the report. "They found signs of blunt trauma," she said finally, "back of the skull and damage to the ribs. He didn't just get lost. Someone had killed Nathaniel, someone with access to the crypt, someone who had reason to hide him." Sloane and I sat across from her, the tape recorder and envelope files spread on her desk. "It was never just about Father John," Sloane said softly. "It was about what he saw, what he learned." Langford nodded. "And who he tried to protect." The hair found in the tin box raised more questions than answers. If Father John had left it there, why? Had he discovered the body? Had he known where Nathaniel was all along, or had he only recently found out and left the handkerchief as a signal, a message, a memorial? The forensics couldn't determine how long it had been sealed in the crypt, but the soil disturbance was recent, less than a year, which meant someone had accessed it, possibly Father John, possibly someone else. Someone trying to move the body or hide it again. A week later, the second wave of tests came in. Soil samples taken from beneath the boy's remains contained trace elements consistent with embalming fluid, formaldehyde, ethanol. Langford stared at the report. He was prepared for burial, she said, at least partially, which meant someone hadn't just dumped the body. They'd handled it, respected it, or tried to preserve a secret. Among the items recovered was a small medal, St. Jude, worn smooth from age, the patron saint of lost causes. In a town like Little Mercy, that felt like prophecy. As the news spread, the church fell under scrutiny it had never seen. Reporters camped on the sidewalk. Diocesan officials were suddenly unavailable. Father Gregson resigned from his post, citing emotional exhaustion. The building was temporarily closed, sealed for investigation, but something still didn't add up. Father John's DNA was in the crypt, the boy's bones were there, but no one could confirm who sealed it or when. The answer, we were sure, lay in the missing week, those last days before Father John vanished. Somewhere, someone still held that thread. Somewhere, the truth had one last door left to open, and I knew from the sound of footsteps that returned to my porch just after midnight that the next envelope had arrived. It came on a Tuesday, slipped between real estate flyers and overdue utility notices. The envelope was plain, no return address, postmarked from within the same county. But what caught the secretary's eye at the parish office wasn't the lack of a sender, it was the name signed at the bottom of the letter inside. John. By the time I got the call, Margaret Denning's hands, were still shaking. "It's him," she whispered. "I swear it's him." I arrived at the rectory half an hour later, the envelope resting on the edge of her desk like it might vanish if touched again. She slid it toward me, and I read the letter once, then again. The handwriting was careful, steady, not the unhinged scrawl of someone on the run, but the measured script of a man who'd had too much time to consider his words. "To whomever still cares," it began, "I am alive. That is all I can say with certainty. I do not ask for forgiveness, only understanding. I did not run to escape guilt. I ran to protect what little truth I still held. When I realized they were watching again, I left before they could decide for me. Nathaniel deserved more than a sealed vault. He deserved to be known, but I cannot be the one to speak. If I do, others will suffer. That is how they made it. That is how it survives. I am still in the shadows of Little Mercy, but I am no longer its shepherd. Please do not look for me. I cannot let anyone know who I am." It was signed simply, John. I read it in silence, then folded it slowly, every cell in my body trying to catch up with the moment. The letter didn't feel like a confession. It felt like a goodbye from a man still breathing, still hiding, still burdened, but something about it pulled at a thread already loose in my mind. The handwriting. It scratched at a memory I hadn't placed yet. 2 weeks earlier, during a routine cleanup in the sacristy, I'd come across a service book left out on the altar. Tucked inside had been a single note, meant to remind someone to adjust the sanctuary candles before Easter Mass. It had seemed harmless, except now, as I replayed the shape of the letters in my mind, it wasn't harmless. The sloped the same way, the F looped just slightly left. I still had the note at home, slipped between pages of one of the old liturgy books I'd borrowed. I rushed back, pulled it out, and laid it side by side with the new letter. Identical. The man who had written the letter had been inside the church no more than 14 days ago. He was still here. Langford confirmed the postmark pointed to a sorting facility 30 miles north, but that didn't mean he wasn't close. We retraced deliveries, checked every adjacent trailer on the edge of town, but he had vanished too well. The priest who had once stood at the altar now walked invisible among the people he had tried to protect. And what haunted me most wasn't that we hadn't found him, it was that he might be watching us uncover the secrets he couldn't outrun, watching the town finally face what it had buried for decades, and still he chose silence. The parish council met one last time. Gregson gone, the room felt hollow. Margaret read the letter aloud to the group, her voice steady until the end. No one interrupted. No one asked where he was. Perhaps because, deep down, they knew that if they looked too closely, they might be forced to see something they couldn't unsee. The council voted to reopen the church after a formal inquiry, but the crypt would remain sealed, this time as a memorial, not a prison. Nathaniel's name was etched onto a brass plaque placed at the base of the sanctuary. For the first time in 30 years, he was acknowledged. Sloane published her final story. She left no names unspoken. She didn't shy away from the church's complicity or the silence that had let it all fester. Her piece ended with a line, "I haven't been able to forget," and I, for the first time in months, felt something like release. But not closure, because sometimes truth doesn't close wounds, it simply lets them breathe. 3 days after the plaque was installed, I saw him, just a glimpse, in the rear pew during the noon Mass, a hood low over his eyes, hands clasped too tightly. He left before communion, slipped out the side door. I didn't follow, because I understood now. Father John wasn't hiding from justice. He was hiding from memory, from what he had seen, what he had failed to stop, what he had tried too late to mend. I still keep the note and the letter. I read them sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through town like a second conscience, and I wonder how many others carry pieces of him in their silence. Little Mercy will never be the same, not because we found the bones, not because we found H. Allinger, but because now we know. And knowing has a weight all its own. He's still out there, a man without a collar, truth without a pulpit, a priest who vanished not into death, but into the very town he once served. And in Little Mercy, some ghosts don't haunt, they just wait. If this story kept you on edge, consider subscribing for more true inspired mysteries like this one. Your support helps uncover even deeper tales. Which moment shocked you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.